The story of Manasseh, the evil king who killed the prophet Isaiah and sacrificed his own children. Bible stories. Bible stories. Extra Bible on the story of Manasseh. Have you ever wondered how far human evil can go? Imagine a king chosen by God who not only abandons his faith but plunges into the darkest practices imaginable, sacrificing his own children and ordering the brutal execution of one of the greatest prophets in history. This is the shocking story of Manasseh, the king who defied God and led his people to the brink of destruction. What makes this biblical account truly extraordinary is that it contains one of the most dramatic transformations ever recorded in ancient history. Here we witness a leader whose actions were so heinous that they altered the course of an entire nation, yet whose story doesn't end in darkness. Think about it. What drives a young prince, raised in righteousness, to embrace such darkness? How does a 12-year-old heir to the throne become one of the most notorious rulers in biblical history? The year is 697 BC, and the kingdom of Judah is about to enter an era that would test the very limits of divine patience. Can you imagine inheriting a kingdom strengthened by your father's faithful reforms, only to systematically destroy everything he built? But this isn't just another tale of a corrupt ruler. What sets Manasseh's story apart is its exploration of the deepest questions about human nature and divine mercy. Can someone who has committed unspeakable atrocities find redemption? Where is the line between justice and mercy? How do the choices of one leader impact generations to come? In this video, we'll uncover the dark secrets of one of the bleakest periods in Judah's history. You'll discover not just the horrifying depths of human depravity, but also witness an unprecedented demonstration of divine grace. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why this story remains profoundly relevant for leaders, parents, and anyone grappling with questions of power, redemption, and the consequences of our choices. Have you ever faced a moment where your actions seemed beyond forgiveness? If you've ever wondered about second chances or questioned whether someone can truly change, drop a 7 in the comments. Your story might be more connected to Manasseh than you think. Part 1. The Seeds of Corruption. How does a righteous kingdom descend into darkness? What subtle shifts in policy and practice pave the way for catastrophic moral decline? And how does a young ruler, raised in the ways of truth, gradually embrace the very practices his father fought to eliminate? The transformation of Manasseh from heir of a righteous kingdom to architect of its spiritual destruction began subtly, as such changes often do. The biblical account in 2 Kings 21 provides us with a haunting glimpse into these early days of compromise. Manasseh, ascending to the throne at just 12 years old, inherited a kingdom that his father Hezekiah had meticulously purified through religious reforms. The temples were clean, the high places destroyed, and the worship of Yahweh restored to its proper place. But the seeds of corruption were already present in the political landscape. Judah, though spiritually renewed, faced mounting pressure from surrounding nations, particularly the mighty Assyrian Empire. As Manasseh grew into his role as king, his advisors, some holdovers from his father's court, Others, new voices promising prosperity through compromise, began suggesting subtle changes to Judah's strict religious policies. The first compromises seemed innocent enough. Perhaps, these voices whispered, allowing small altars to foreign gods in the outlying regions could improve our diplomatic relations. After all, wasn't peace worth some minor concessions? The young king, eager to prove himself as a sophisticated ruler, found these arguments compelling. The biblical text hints at this gradual shift. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nation, 2 Kings 21:2. What began as diplomatic tolerance soon evolved into active curiosity. Manasseh began attending ceremonies dedicated to foreign deities, initially claiming it was merely to understand his allies better. But the allure of these exotic rituals, with their sensual appeal and promises of power, proved intoxicating. The king, who once sat at the feet of prophets learning the law of Moses, now found himself drawn to the mysterious practices of pagan priests. The transformation accelerated as Manasseh's power grew. Each compromise made the next one easier. Small altars in remote areas became larger temples in prominent locations. Diplomatic observation of foreign rituals evolved into active participation. The young king, who had once questioned these practices, now became their passionate advocate. Most troubling was the way Manasseh began to rewrite Judah's history. He argued that his father's reforms, far from being divinely inspired, had been unnecessarily rigid and economically damaging. "Look at our prosperous neighbors," he would say, gesturing to the wealthy pagan cities surrounding Judah. "Their gods don't demand such exclusivity, and yet they thrive." The priests and prophets of Yahweh watched in growing horror as their young king systematically dismantled his father's legacy. Those who spoke out found themselves increasingly marginalized. Some were removed from their positions, others threatened into silence. The biblical record tells us that Manasseh shed very much innocent blood till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, 2 Kings 21:16. What makes this initial period so chilling is its gradual nature. No single decision marked Manasseh's turn from righteousness to evil. Instead, it was a series of small compromises, each seemingly reasonable in isolation, that paved the way for greater apostasy. This pattern of gradual corruption serves as a warning about how subtle the path to moral collapse can be. The seeds of corruption planted during these early years would soon bear bitter fruit. As Manasseh's confidence grew, so did his boldness in defying the God of his ancestors. The stage was set for even darker chapters in his reign, as the king, who began with diplomatic compromises, would soon embrace practices that would shock even his pagan allies. As troubling as these early compromises were, they were merely a prelude to the horrors that would follow. With each barrier broken, each line crossed, Manasseh moved closer to actions that would earn him the reputation as one of the most notorious kings in biblical history. The question was no longer if he would completely abandon his father's faith, but how far into darkness he would descend. Part 2. The Descent into Darkness. How does a king chosen by God transform into a servant of darkness? What drives a ruler to not only abandon his faith, but to actively desecrate the very temple his ancestors built? And perhaps most chillingly, how does the corruption of one leader's soul spread like a poison through an entire nation? As Manasseh's reign progressed, the subtle compromises of his early years gave way to increasingly bold acts of defiance against Yahweh. The biblical account in 2 Chronicles 33:3-5 paints a vivid picture of this transformation. He rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars for the Baals and made Asherah poles. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord. Consider the profound significance of these actions. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't just another religious building. It was the dwelling place of God's presence among His people, the heart of their covenant relationship with Yahweh. By erecting pagan altars within its sacred precincts, Manasseh was committing an act of spiritual treason unprecedented in Judah's history. But the darkness was only beginning to unfold. The king's embrace of paganism went far beyond mere political expedience. He immersed himself in the occult practices of surrounding nations, establishing schools of divination and sorcery where once the prophets had taught God's law. The biblical text tells us he practiced divination and witchcraft, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. 2 Chronicles 33:3-6. Perhaps most disturbing was Manasseh's introduction of child sacrifice to the kingdom. In the valley of Ben Hinnom, just outside Jerusalem's walls, the screams of innocent children would pierce the night air as they were offered to Molech, a Canaanite deity whose worship demanded the most terrible of sacrifices. This valley, known in later times as Gehenna, became so associated with horror that its name would become synonymous with hell itself in Jewish and Christian tradition. The spiritual darkness emanating from the palace spread throughout society like a malignant growth. Families were torn apart as some embraced the new practices while others tried to maintain their ancestral faith in secret. The educational system, once centered on teaching God's law, was corrupted to promote occult practices. The economy suffered as trading partners, even pagan ones, became wary of dealing with a kingdom that had embraced such extreme practices. But what makes this descent particularly tragic is that it didn't happen overnight. Each step into darkness was a choice. Each compromise made the next one easier. The priests and prophets who initially raised their voices in protest were systematically silenced. Those who remained faithful to Yahweh found themselves increasingly marginalized, forced to practice their faith in the shadows. The temple, once the glory of Jerusalem, became a monument to spiritual confusion. Imagine walking through its courts, where the altar of Yahweh now stood alongside shrines to Baal, Asherah, and the astral deities of Assyria. The sacred space that Solomon had dedicated to the exclusive worship of Yahweh had become, in effect, a pagan pantheon. Yet even in this darkest hour, when it seemed that the corruption was complete, a remnant of faithful believers kept the true worship of Yahweh alive. They preserved the scrolls of the law and the writings of the prophets, waiting for the day when God would intervene. And intervene He would, though not in the way anyone expected. As we stand at this point in the narrative, with Jerusalem transformed into a center of paganism and the king leading his people ever deeper into darkness, an unexpected confrontation is about to unfold. The prophet Isaiah, who had served through the reigns of 4 previous kings, would soon raise his voice against Manasseh's depravity. This clash between prophet and king would lead to one of the most dramatic martyrdoms in biblical history and set the stage for divine judgment that would shake the kingdom to its foundations. Part 3. The Prophet's Last Stand. What does it take for a man of God to stand against absolute power? How does one find the courage to speak truth when truth itself becomes a death sentence? As Manasseh's reign deepened into darkness, one voice dared to rise above the cacophony of pagan worship and child sacrifice: the voice of Isaiah, God's faithful prophet. Isaiah was no stranger to confronting kings. The scriptures tell us in Isaiah 1:01 that he had served through the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Now, in his final years, this venerable prophet faced perhaps his greatest challenge, confronting the murderous apostasy of King Manasseh. Having witnessed the righteous reign of Hezekiah, Isaiah must have felt profound grief watching the son destroy everything the father had built. The confrontation between prophet and king played out against a backdrop of increasing tension in Jerusalem. The temple, once purified by Hezekiah, now stood defiled with pagan altars. The valleys around the city echoed with the screams of sacrificed children. In this atmosphere of terror and apostasy, Isaiah's voice thundered with divine authority. Drawing from ancient Jewish traditions and biblical accounts, we can piece together the dramatic final days of Isaiah's ministry. The prophet, likely in his 80s by this time, stood before Manasseh's court with the same fearless conviction that had characterized his entire ministry. The biblical text in 2 Kings 21:10-15 preserves the essence of his message. The Lord spoke through his servants the prophets. Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these detestable sins. Therefore I am going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. Imagine the scene. The elderly prophet, his beard white with age but his eyes blazing with holy fire, standing before the young king, who had already demonstrated his willingness to shed innocent blood. The contrast could not have been more stark. Divine wisdom confronting corrupted power, prophetic truth challenging royal authority. Manasseh's response to Isaiah's warnings revealed the depths of his depravity. 2 Kings 21:16 tells us that he shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. Jewish tradition, preserved in the Talmud, provides a haunting account of Isaiah's final moments. When Manasseh ordered his execution, the elderly prophet fled and sought refuge in a hollow cedar tree, but the fringes of his garment remained visible. Upon discovery, Manasseh ordered the tree to be sawn in half, with Isaiah still inside. This brutal martyrdom is believed to be referenced in Hebrews 11:37, which speaks of faithful servants of God who were sawn in two. The death of Isaiah marked more than the end of a prophet's life. It represented the silencing of God's voice in a nation that had chosen darkness over light. The significance of this confrontation extends far beyond its historical context. Isaiah's stand against Manasseh exemplifies the timeless struggle between truth and power, between divine authority and human corruption. His martyrdom serves as a powerful reminder that speaking truth often comes at a great personal cost. As Isaiah's blood soaked into Jerusalem's soil, It seemed that darkness had triumphed. The last great prophetic voice of the pre-exilic period had been silenced. Yet, even in death, Isaiah's words would continue to echo through the centuries. His prophecies, preserved by faithful followers, would survive not only Manasseh's reign, but would continue to inspire and guide generations to come. With the prophet's voice silenced, Manasseh's reign would plunge into even deeper depths of depravity. The king who had silenced God's messenger would soon discover that while prophets can be killed, truth cannot be forever suppressed. Divine patience, though vast, was not infinite, and judgment was drawing near. Part 4. The ultimate transgression. How far can a ruler's corruption take them from their divine calling? What drives a king to commit the unthinkable act of sacrificing his own children? And how does a society respond when its leader plunges into the darkest depths of depravity? The scriptures reveal a particularly horrific turning point in Manasseh's reign that shocked even those who had witnessed his prior apostasy. In 2 Kings 21:6, we find the chilling account. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. This wasn't a single isolated incident. The biblical record in 2 Chronicles 33:6 expands on this horror, noting that he sacrificed children, plural, in the valley of Ben Hinnom. This location would become so infamous that its name, Gehenna, would later be used as a metaphor for hell itself in the New Testament. Imagine the terror that must have gripped Jerusalem as smoke rose from that valley, carrying with it the unthinkable evidence of royal infanticide. The practice of child sacrifice was associated with the worship of Molech, a Canaanite deity whose cult was particularly abhorrent to Yahweh. The ritual typically involved heating a metal statue until it was glowing red, then placing the child in its arms. The screams of the victims were drowned out by drums and flutes, a detail that makes the horror even more palpable. This wasn't just apostasy, it was a descent into the darkest forms of paganism that Israel had been commanded to eradicate. The impact on Jewish society was devastating. Families were torn apart as the practice spread beyond the royal household. The prophet Jeremiah, who was born during Manasseh's reign, would later condemn these practices in Jeremiah 32:35. They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Moloch, though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing. The temple, once the center of Yahweh's worship, became a house of horrors. Manasseh installed a carved image, likely of Asherah, in the very place where God had promised to put his name forever. The sacred courts were